SC Media is proud to present this month's CISO Stories program, hosted by yours truly, Jessica Hoffman. This is a show where CISOs share tales from the trenches and unpack leadership lessons learned along the way. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. The Cyber Risk Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, please visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CRC. All right, greetings. We're back for another episode of CISO Stories Podcast with yours truly, Jess Hoffman, as your host. We got Dustin Sachs with us, Dr. Dustin, actually. That's your new nickname, Dustin, whether you like. That's Dr. Dustin. He's here with us today. We're going to talk about his dissertation that he wrote. He has a new journal article out about it, and it's super interesting about behavioral science and cybersecurity and tool selection, because that's what we're doing this month. But before we get started, if you don't know who Dustin is, you really should, because that means you're not paying attention to CRA. So Dustin is usually you'll see him as the webcast host for CISO Stories as well. What's up, Dustin? Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Great to be here, Jess. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we get excited. We're excited.
Tool selection is an exciting topic.
Yeah, it is, man. Like, why do people do dumb stuff, right? Nope. And how can we help them not make dumb decisions, right? So, your article that you have out that was just published, I believe you said September 18th. So I haven't had a chance to read it. I know you were briefing me on it, so I'm really looking forward to it, and we'll make sure to tell the listeners how they can read it as well. It's titled A Qualitative Exploration into Decision-Making in Supply Chain Cyber Risk Management. That sounds so loaded. Like, there's so much there to unpack. What tell us some of the highlights that you found in your research. I guess you've been living and breathing this for quite some time, Dr. Dustin. So yeah, how does that tie into how we're making our tool selections, especially third-party risk management? I mean, we talked about that last month when I was on your webcast as well.
Yeah. So I started out, I started my career in forensics and, with very much of this repeatable scientific process. And then I moved into kind of the security management GRC space. And what I was finding was I would give a risk assessment to somebody on my team for a third party, and depending on who I gave it to, I was getting a very different result. And this just, for me, coming from the mindset of, wanting to have a repeatable process, this didn't really compute very well. It didn't work. So I was wondering, so I started to look, as I started my doctoral program, at, why might that be? And what I started to find was really went down to the decision-making processes. And it wasn't so much that the third-party risk process we were following was the problem or was the issue, but it was really went even deeper to the psychology and the behavioral science of the individuals making the decision. So I started to look at this issue to see, what could possibly explain it. And, one of the quickest kind of answers, and one of the things that started to make the most sense, was this idea of cognitive bias. And really, I think I was introduced to the book Noise by Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sussman and Olivier Sibony, which was written in 2021. And I was looking at this and going, oh my God, this is the problem. It's this unwanted variability. It's this situations where you don't want there to be difference in the outcome, but there is.
You mentioned cognitive biases. That is also loaded in itself. We not even just from a cyber perspective or how we're moving online as individuals within the workspace, etc. Just biases, are intertwined with pretty much everything we're dealing as a society. So when you were working through your research, how did those cognitive biases actually play into individuals, and even at the leadership level, or just, folks that are trying to be more efficient in their day-to-day tasks? How did those cognitive biases really lead individuals to make certain purchases. I shouldn't say individual because nobody nobody should be buying stuff in a vacuum. But how did that impact the type of tools that were actually selected and implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing that I found was, one of my doctoral professors said, find that statistic that's going to like open people's eyes. And what I found very quickly was we as humans make on average about 35,000 decisions a day. Now, obviously, some of those are automatic. Should I breathe? Should I not? Very few of us stop and
You
think
should
about,
breathe. Yes.
hey, am I breathe? Should I take the next breath? Now, I always joke, unless you're underwater or in a position where, there's danger from breathing, most of us don't stop and think about whether or not we're breathing. But it even ranges to things like, and I ask this when I give presentations, which is how many people in the audience think about the path they're taking to the grocery store or to their kid's school. You don't think about that. You don't sit there and do an analysis of what is the traffic flow going to look like? How long is it going to take me? You take the same route every day because you're familiar with it. You know what to expect generally, and you've accepted that, hey, I'm good with that decision. That's good in many cases. I mean, the thing I always say is cognitive bias is not necessarily a bad thing. If a lion is coming at you, cognitive bias says to run. Great thing to have. None of us want to get eaten by a lion. I mean, I don't think any of us want to get
No.
eaten by a lion. But where it becomes a problem is where you believe you're making a decision based on a set of criteria that you're really not. And this is where the research really turned, which was a lot of organizations, when I would ask them, they would say, and individuals within organizations, they would say, we take a risk-based approach to our third-party risk and to deciding which vendors we're going to work with. And what I then started to find out as I tested this, as I gave them scenarios and I provided information that was very much realistic, things like, the statement, simply the exact statement of they've got a PCI certification and they're willing to provide the certificate. No explanation about what that PCI certificate said, nothing about what the report said, nothing about any findings if there were any issues. Just the fact that they've got the certificate was enough for those people who have between 2 and 32 years of experience in third-party risk to go, you know what, I can lower my risk rating. And that was one that I saw really almost in almost 100% of the cases, was just that existence of that authority was enough to lower the risk. And the trick with that, or the challenge with that, is if we look at some of the supply chain risks that we've seen, some of the tool-based breaches we've seen over the last couple of years, every one of those organizations had one of those certificates. So just the existence of the certificate doesn't mean you're somehow less risky than any other organization. So it really forces the individual to really think about, why am I asking this question? What am I really looking for in getting this certificate? Now, if the goal of the certificate is I want to use it so that I don't have to ask a whole series of other questions, that's fine, as long as you're accounting for the potential that you might not be getting the right picture or the full picture. It's really, again, it's about understanding the process of how we make the decision, and are we comfortable with the way we made the decision, regardless of what that decision is. And it's this idea of decision hygiene, and really looking at not only did we come to the right decision, but did we come to the right decision in the right way, or in a way that we're comfortable with, in a way that matches our risk tolerance. Because otherwise, you might be thinking you're making a risk-based decision, but when you look at it, you're making a decision based on anecdotal evidence. We got, somebody at another company said they had really good success with this tool. And the example I always give to kind of poke a hole in anecdotal evidence is, how many times have people gone to a restaurant or a movie based on the advice of a friend and walked out and gone, that movie or that restaurant was horrible. Like, why? Who is my friend? Like, I got to reevaluate whether or not you're my friend or anything, because you clearly don't know me. You went because your friend told you this was going to be great, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Results may vary, kind of scenario. So it's really about being very deliberate in your thought process, very deliberate in your analysis, and making sure that you're making the decisions based on the risk it's going to present to your organization, and what controls am I going to put in place to account for the various risks, and which is the least risky, which is going to require the least amount of complementary or protective controls in place to put them in, to bring them in.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Dustin, about the SOC report, because there's just so many ways to discuss that. One that comes to mind first is some organizations don't even have security professionals who would even understand what a SOC report is, right? Or how to read it or how to interpret it. And then there's different versions, type 1, type 2, type 3, which you're never going to get the full blown every detail from the SOC report, even if you understand it or not. You're relying on the vendor to share the amount of information that you need to make that risk based decision for purchase. So I think that that's like one. There's one, that right there, because we might not even know what we're looking at, right? So there's that, and then how do we hold that vendor accountable as well? So it's kind of like what you see is what you get. You buy as is. No warranty to some degree. That communication that you're supposed to continue to have with the vendor when it comes to are they closing their poems, or what is their risk posture? Are they effectively communicating what is involved with their environment and how that trickles down to yours to make those risk-based decisions? And just having a SOC, as you mentioned, just because you have a SOC does not mean it is a mature environment that the vendor has. It means that they went through the process of having a SOC assessment, which I've done SOC assessments and I have my opinions on them. Um, but that's neither here nor there. But that definitely is a requirement, right? First base, okay, do you have a SOC? Do you have a HIPAA assessment? Do you have a high trust? Do you follow some kind of NIST controls? But I think that we are really held to the mercy of these vendors, because they can show us that all day, but if we don't understand what we're looking at, don't have capabilities within our organization to understand that, or if they're not maybe responsive, or they're not providing that continued communication and visibility within their organization, so we can continue to again assess our risks by using those tools. And I think I feel like that's kind of like the baseline that everybody's like, oh, do you have a SOC report? But it really needs to go a little bit deeper than that, because just having a SOC report does not mean we can solely rely on these vendors to provide us with a tool that would reduce our risk if they got compromised, and not the attacker not being able to pivot to our organization, let alone get our data, right? So was there anything else that you saw besides the SOC report that you felt like a lot of organizations were like, oh, you got a SOC report, great. What else do you have that would make me feel all warm and fuzzy?
Yeah, no, and I think what you bring up is important. It's not just. I mean, there is value in asking if they've got the SOC report, because all things being equal, if I've got two vendors and one has it and one doesn't, certainly that can help differentiate. So it's not to say that it isn't valuable to ask. First of all, knowing, like you said, knowing what to look for, knowing to look for the complementary controls, look for the gaps. I mean, it's not a very highly guarded secret that you can basically you buy a SOC 2 report. I mean, if you pay to get it, you're pretty much going to get it, because your auditor is going to work with you until you get it, because they're getting paid by the hour. Um, I think the thing about it is, one, again, knowing why are you asking for it is important. Um, I also think of it kind of similar to the way we approach, or we try to coach people on cloud security. Just because I'm using a third party doesn't mean I can abdicate all responsibility. I mean, if you look at some of the breaches we've had recently, Uber, SolarWinds, many of these other ones, MGM, they were all third party contractors third parties that were the ones that were compromised, but we refer to them by the company that hired them. And I think that's an important distinction, which is when a breach happens, it's not going to be sufficient to go, well, but we hired a third party to do this. It's going to be on you. It's your reputation on the line, and therefore it's important to make sure that you're doing what's necessary, and you're putting in the requisite controls to assume something is going to go wrong. The other things that I found in the research that were really interesting was the fact that really, and it seems kind of so simple, but yet is such an important thing to point out, is the more experienced individuals were, and the more years of experience, tenure that they had in the organization, actually the more biased they were. And it makes a lot of sense when you stop and think about it. You get busier, you have to introduce more heuristics, more mental shortcuts. So you get busier, you're making more decisions, you introduce more bias, because the idea of bias is to get to a point where I'm satisfied, I've made as good enough decision, and I'm moving on. So as you get more experienced, you end up being more biased. But what's interesting about it, I say funny, but what's kind of interesting about it is the more experienced you are, the more likely you are to get handed the third-party risk assessment, because you're seen as being more experienced. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. So it was that kind of that aspect of things that was really interesting. The other one that was really interesting to me, only because of the paradox that it created, and this was something that I didn't see a lot in the literature about, so I really almost coined the term myself, which is this ambiguity paradox that exists. We all know cybersecurity. We all agree cybersecurity is a large amount of ambiguity. I mean, if you look at the basic formula for identifying risk, it's likelihood times impact, and likelihood is all about ambiguity. Will it or will it not happen? So we all live in this world of ambiguity, but yet when they were presented with information in the scenarios, one of the most common refrains I would hear from participants was, I wish I had more information. And it was never, the scenarios were not, they were pre-tested by individuals at the CISO level and throughout the kind of experience level to see how realistic they were. And every one of the three scenarios was deemed to be extremely realistic. I mean, I had people saying that were part of the test group that said, I just saw one of these last week, this exact same scenario. So it wasn't that I was withholding information that they would have otherwise gotten. They still looked at it and they said, if I had this much more information, I could give you this. I'd have this much more confidence in what I was doing. So that lack of ambiguity, but understanding that we're in an industry of ambiguity, was a really interesting paradox to see. I mean, and then of course, I saw the same kind of like, oh, everyone's using them, bandwagon stuff. A lot of the kind of same, I've seen this before, kind of biases that are common when you talk about cognitive biases. And the important thing to remember is cognitive biases. So when we hear the word biases, we all immediately think of things like gender and race and ethnicities and those, kind of overt biases. And we look at them as being a very negative thing. And I want to reiterate the fact that bias on its own is not a bad thing. Bias on its own is simply a favoritism for or against something. And there, again, as we've talked about earlier, there are very valid reasons to have biases for or against certain things, because they're meant for, protecting yourself or keeping yourself safe or keeping your family safe or other things. We all have biases towards not intentionally doing things that are going to get us injured, and that's a good bias to have. But it's more about understanding and recognizing that that you've brought in a bias and saying either I'm okay in this case with that bias being there and here's why, or not. But it's really just understanding and being able to recognize that you've done it and determine whether or not you're okay with it.
So you just made me think about, and this is a near and dear topic to my heart as far as emotional intelligence and having diverse teams within your organization. And this is to me, I just heard you give a really good example of why you want to have a diverse team when you're making tool selections or when you're doing your review of proposals, because whether it's a good bias or not, or has founded, good founding measures or not, to get that variety of perspective could bring a lot. It could be more rewarding during that selection process because of those perspectives. What you
Yeah,
just said
absolutely.
too.
I mean, having
Yeah.
bringing in those diverse perspectives, that's one of the key ways, one of the top kind of decision hygiene suggestions is to have a diverse team. Now you got to be careful. You've also got to be careful about falling into either groupthink or consensus bias, which is I think I'm going to make a decision based on what I think the rest of the group is going to like or agree with. Actually, having that discussion can be of value, especially when you're making a decision about a tool that multiple people are going to use. The
Absolutely.
other thing that was really interesting, and the other thing that is important to note is oftentimes we're very reticent to let the junior, entry level people be involved in some of the decision making because they come from either an academic background or they don't have a lot of experience. And what I found was that those people tended to be more likely to make data driven decisions than the people who are more experienced. So there is value in letting somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience, who hasn't been, jaded or sullied or whatever, hasn't had that level of experience involved in the conversation to provide that almost independent perspective.
Yeah, and that was the other thing you mentioned, just the more seasoned professionals. You just said jaded, but it is that way. I think we've both been through contracts or vendors that we had a bad experience, whether it's the product itself or bad comms or they were just jerks, whatever. So we will probably not work with them again, and we
Right.
probably don't have any positive things to say to or referral. Right? Community matters, and you've mentioned that too. So I have a question for you. As far as the biases to tend to stay with the same vendor, I've seen this go either way with some of the organizations I've worked with in my prior experience as an auditor. But I saw a lot of times that companies would stick with the same company, the same service over and over again for years and years and years. And I was wondering what's your experience, whether it's personally, professionally, or what you saw in your research. Do you think that's a good idea to keep the same company around for years and years doing the same service?
Yeah, so there's a couple of interesting biases here. One is what's known as the sunk cost fallacy, the fallacy that, well, I've already spent a ton of money with them and it's going to cost me more to replace them than the money that I've already spent. Which it can be an important one, and you certainly you don't want to be changing your vendor every year. But there is value in evaluating, at least evaluating, is there a vendor out there that maybe fits the bill better, that does it differently, that can better meet your kind of criteria. So reevaluating every 2-3 years to see what has changed in the landscape is important. There's also what's known as status quo bias, status quo fallacy, which is this idea that, well, it's what we've always done. We hear that oftentimes. Well, we've been doing this, following the same process for 20
That's the
years.
worst.
It's the
That's the
we've been
worst.
following this process for 20 years. It's the way we do it. And I mean, we could go either extreme or not extreme in the annals of history, where the status quo bias has been a problem outside of cybersecurity, where this mindset of, well, that's how we've always done it, doesn't mean that it's right. I mean, and I'm not going to get into, any of the historical examples, but there is value. The most important thing is not whether or not you stay with the same vendor for years and years and years and years and years. It's, are you using that as a reason not to look at anybody else? Or are you regularly going, benchmarking essentially and going, yeah, this is still the best vendor in this market. This is still the best vendor for this. We've looked at others out there, and we've done an independent. And if we made this decision today with no tool in the environment, this is the tool we would select. That one's hard because, again, you get comfort, you get familiarity, you get used to using the tool, you've built a relationship with them, and it's hard to divorce yourself from that. But it's really important that that's where bringing somebody who maybe from the outside, from another part of the organization, or having somebody from the outside come in and evaluate for you whether or not you're still using the best in the market or the right tool for your stack. So this is where you need to be willing to have a third party, an independent, objective person come in. So maybe it's finding the person on your team who hasn't been here for 3 years and used the tool since the beginning, or you find the person on the team who isn't every day in this tool and go, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's the tool that we're using. And here are the others that are out there, because as we've seen, new tools, companies are coming out all the time. And it's very easy to look at the big players and say, well, I'm always going to go with Microsoft, or I'm always going to go with Amazon, or I'm always going to go with Google, and miss some of the very good small startup companies that are out there and go, I'm not even going to pay attention to them. But, I can name a handful of startups that would never have gotten the attention they deserved if people didn't say, you know what, I'm willing to look at, these smaller companies. Plus, just from a pure pricing standpoint, you're typically going to get a better deal, and save some money sometimes by going with the smaller startup companies that may have exactly what you need and be willing to tailor it a lot better. So,
Yeah, and I think that's great. We obviously need to be supportive of these startup companies, but there's a lot of risk there, right? If they don't stick around. So
oh yeah,
coming from
absolutely.
government space, the maturity there of those startups. And I had a guest on already as well that's in Tokyo, and she was explaining how she's worked with in Japan and the UK and Europe, and they're much, much less risk averse than American companies. We just kind of like, let's try it, let's do it, let's be the first, let's be innovative. But yeah, I think there's a lot of value in going after, like you said, those startups because they're hungry. It's usually better pricing points. They'll go above and beyond and exceed client expectations. And I just feel like that's the great thing to do, right? That's how we're enhancing and supporting and being that innovative pillar of the world that America, that we do, right? Silicon Valley. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of other countries that produce fantastic tech. But that's kind of like our niche too. We want to be on the forefront of all things tech, including cyber.
Well, it gives you a chance to work with a vendor, and say, "This is how I think you should build. Like, here's how you could make your tool work better for people like me and company organizations like me." So, I mean, I've worked with several companies before where we've brought them into, Fortune 100 companies, where we've been able to drive some of the features that they would otherwise not have included, maybe as quickly or at all, and get them to actually put it in. And then they go and show it to other companies, and those companies go, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
amazing. And we can go, yeah, you know what? We're glad that we were able to help suggest
hmm
it, because, otherwise you wouldn't have had it. So there is value. Certainly, yes, there is risk, and you've got to be careful about it. Like, you shouldn't be going to, some two-person company in their garage. But at the same time, we've seen many scenarios where that two-person in a garage turned out to be, I mean, a pretty amazing thing where, you know, we've got tons of Mac
Ridiculousness.
users and tons of people on Windows, thanks to two people in a garage deciding to do something. So I don't want to discount it. It is about really truly understanding your risk and really truly understanding your risk tolerance and figuring out, you know, in modern day business, you have to be some level of risk seeking in order to truly succeed. So you can't be completely isolationist and completely risk averse, because you're not gonna succeed. But it is about finding that balance and finding what's comfortable and what's the best for you. And I mean, public companies, yeah, it's all about, protecting the shareholder value, but it's also about increasing shareholder value. And some of that is taking some risks, some calculated risks. And that's why it's so important to look at and go, am I working with the right vendors? Have I made the decisions correctly? Because so often it's, well, somebody knows somebody, or one of the senior execs is on the board of this company as well, or they gave us the best price. And company, the number of times I've been involved, and I'm sure you have as well, been involved in vendor RFP scenarios where the whole goal of the vendors is to figure out who can do the most for the least amount of money.
That never
It's not
works
always
out.
a good thing to
No.
race to the cheapest. You get what you pay for kind of sometimes, and we've got to be very careful not to make the decision solely based on price. Price should be a function of it. You have a certain budget. You can't spend, and not everybody can spend RSA Archer kind of money on a GRC platform, but it's understanding, what am I sacrificing to get that lower price, and understanding that, and what risk does making this decision pose, and how am I going to account for it. So again, it's all about understanding the way that the decision making you're using influences the risk. What risk does it create? Because every decision, basic economics, every decision has an opportunity cost, and it's understanding what is that opportunity cost and what does that mean for the organization, and how do I minimize the risk to my organization, but not understanding how you're making the decision and thinking you're making a risk-based decision without understanding the criteria you've really used and what you may have introduced that may not be things you wanted to introduce, is important. And that's really what the point of the research was to say, it's not that you're making bad decisions, it's that you don't understand why you're making the decisions you're making. And that's where the value really comes, is to, again, if you want to use certain cognitive biases to make your decision, great, as long as you understand that you're doing that. And so many people in the research that I did not, and even the people I was talking to in preparing the research, didn't recognize that they were making decisions based on the criteria they thought they were using was not the criteria they in fact were using.
Right. So yeah, I'm sure we could talk for a while, and you probably have talked for a while about your
Yep.
research and that very important stuff. Timely, regardless of size of organization, data, public, private service, etc. We started off with the SOC report isn't everything. It's a good starting point, but as you just mentioned, sometimes what we think is good criteria, we don't necessarily have the full picture. So understanding what that means, what to ask for during the procurement process, whether it's a large type of software like a IAM or something, or maybe you're just buying a security tool for continuous monitoring. Understanding what to ask for and what that means, and how you incorporate that into your existing organization's risk posture. I think that was one of the things you mentioned, and I really, again, is my jam about having diverse organization structures because of the experiences and perspectives they can give. And it's not saying gender and race and culture. It could be age, experience, coming from public to private, where they live in the world, right? There's so much more to a diverse team than just the typical of what we think about. So I think that was a really great point, and how that perspective, those unique those unique injections from those people can assist with the procurement as well. So thank you. And they bring, like you said, their cognitive biases based on their experience and who they are. So I think that's a great way to qualitative, put that there so folks can, kind of take that back. And of course, risk-based decisions, RBD. I love that. That's all we do every day. I made a risk-based decision to get up this morning and hang out in the city of Philadelphia. So, and I took it. I'm here. It's great. We love it. So we are at time, man. Just tell us how everybody can find you and your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly LinkedIn, great place to find me. My research is also, I've posted about the research, but it's also available on the Cyber Risk Alliance website. It was just posted on the blogs page there. And I'm very visible within CRA and Cyber Risk Alliance, different webcasts, and always available. Again, LinkedIn is one of the best places. And I would just say, my biggest thing, the biggest message I would leave people is just, we talk about cybersecurity and we talk about the human element of cybersecurity. We really need to understand how humans, not just the end users, but us as the decision makers, how we're kind of interacting with the world and the behavioral science things that we bring in, because that's the only way we're going to make sure that we can meet everybody, in the middle and actually make real changes, not only understanding end users, but also understanding our own kind of decision-making processes.
Yes, meet people where they are. All right, Dr. Dustin, 30 seconds. Tell me what advice you give your 18-year-old self.
Be willing to embrace things that you may not comport with your worldview. Be willing to look at the other side of things and consider that there's value in the other side.
Love it. Love it. Thank you, Dr. Dustin. Appreciate
Thank you, Jess.
I'll see you soon.
Awesome.
Thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode. Thanks for joining.